Hi guys, today we have a probably shorter video and it's a bit late, my fault, sorry. But I'm going to be doing today a beginner's guide to retro gaming. Before we start with the main things, I'm going to just quickly address these. These are classic systems or mini systems. These aren't the only three, well these are the only three that are out right now, but there's going to be a Sega Mega Drive / Genesis one coming out soon as well to join these three. These are pretty great for getting into retro gaming. The NES and SNES Classic, for the pair of them, is probably about as much as you spend buying a real NES and a real SNES without any games. Because an NES Classic is like £50 and an SNES Classic is £80. That's pretty much the average prices of both of these systems in real life, like secondhand. So they're great for getting into retro gaming. The PlayStation Classic's a bit harder to recommend because, see, the PlayStation Classic it's weird. Like, the NES and SNES Classic have great games on them across the board. Like, they're great. Like 20 and 30 of the best games ever made for the systems. The PlayStation Classic has a lot of decent games on it. And it has some of the best of all time on it, but the library's not as consistently good as the other two. And the PlayStation Classic is so cheap right now that it's almost worth asking. If you really want PlayStation, you might as well just buy a PS1 or PS2. The games can be more expensive, so the PlayStation Classic's pretty hard to not recommend, especially how inexpensive it is now. Some of the games for the PlayStation are going up in price just because of how old it is really. It's over 20 years old now, nearly 25. So games get expensive, but the PlayStation itself is not hard to get. We'll come back to the PlayStation later though, but it's hard to recommend the NES and SNES Classic to the beginner, not the classics, the originals, to a beginner because they can be expensive, especially the SNES. That can be way more than 80 sometimes. So it's hard to recommend those two to someone starting out. The classic systems are a much better alternative to someone who's just getting into retro gaming. But great option for those starting out is this, the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis. I got mine for £25 with the game and everything you need to run it, It's hard to not recommend it because unlike the SNES, this thing has basically nowhere near as much value for some reason. Like, it doesn't see the amount of... It's nowhere near as expensive as the SNES gets, which I don't understand why, but it's good for people trying to get into retro gaming because they're plentiful. They sold quite a lot. I think it's like somewhere near 40 million Mega Drives exist. So for anyone basically, especially if you're in Europe or South America or North America, they're really common. If you're in Japan, it's not as common. But it's still a really great system to get into. Cannot recommend the Mega Drive / Genesis enough because of just how easy it is to collect for. There's a lot of great games on it. Like, it's hard not to recommend the Sega Genesis to anyone wanting to start out. Good games to get. I mean, it was the 90s. The best games on systems were usually 2D platformers. So you had things like Vector Man, Rise Star, and the Sonic the Hedgehog games. Yes, this was back in the time where liking Sonic was cool. There was a time where that was the case. But the original three Sonic games on Genesis are pretty good. So, definitely pick up a Genesis. Probably a great starting point, actually. I mean, I think out of all of them, it's probably the one I got first. Like, as in, I actually bought it and haven't had it since I was a child. So, definitely great to get into. Definitely a great way to start. Now, the PlayStation 1. I would bring up the N64, but I don't have one. And there's nowhere near as many games. There is thousands more games on PlayStation than there is on the N64. The N64 library is smaller than the Dreamcast library, and that thing only was out for 2 years. But we'll come back to that maybe. The PlayStation is so cheap. Even this one, which this is the one you want to get. If you're going to get a PlayStation, I recommend getting this one, because it's more reliable than the original grey one that the PlayStation Classic is based off. This one's way more reliable because it doesn't have a certain problem with the laser that the original does. So if you're getting a PlayStation, get this one. They're around about the same price, honestly. Games, some of them are cheaper, and some of them are way more expensive. But the games you want to mainly get for the PlayStation, I would recommend getting Gran Turismo 1 and 2. They're brilliant racing games. Crash Bandicoot, the entire series is pretty great on the PlayStation. Though you can get it, the remaster trilogy, but if you're wanting to get into the retro scene, you're probably going to want to play the retro games. So, Spyro the Dragon games are pretty good on PlayStation as well. And obviously, you've got Final Fantasy VII and Metal Gear Solid, probably the two most famous games on the system, which are on the PlayStation Classic. But they're still pretty cheap, I think. I mean, last time I checked, Final Fantasy VII used was about £10. So, the PlayStation is definitely a great way to get into it. But it's hard to recommend a PS1 when you can just get a PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 is the best-selling console ever, and they are so common now. Like, a PlayStation 2 is about £30 maybe. They're so cheap, and they're so great. There's over 5,000 games on the PlayStation 2, and I'm pretty sure there's at least 2,000 games on PS1, probably closer to 3,000, maybe even more. So you've got possibly a library of 8,000 games on this one system. So, the PlayStation 2 is a great system to get into for retro gaming. It can play so many games, and it has so many great games of its own. Like, you got Twisted Metal Black, you've got all the GTAs, which are super common to get because they're the best-selling games on the PlayStation 2. Basically, the 6th generation, which is what the PlayStation 2 is part of, is kind of what I would recommend to everyone. Like, I would recommend that you get a PS2, an Xbox, or a GameCube, so you get one of those three, along with the Sega Dreamcast. This might have been predictable for some people, but you can't go wrong with the Dreamcast. It's way more expensive than everything else here. Like, mine was £70, but that came with 6 games. But the Dreamcast has so many exclusive games on the Dreamcast that aren't on the PS2, Xbox, or GameCube. So I would recommend someone starting out have a PlayStation 2 and a Dreamcast and probably a Sega Genesis. And if you want to go even further back, you can get the NES and SNES Classic as well. Although the SNES Classic came out after Genesis, so. But yeah, Dreamcast's exclusive lineup is pretty great. There's not that many games on it, and some games are starting to get pricey. But the amount of fun you'll have with the Dreamcast is unbelievable. You have such great games, like you have Crazy Taxi, you have Resident Evil Code Veronica, you have Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. This was like the last time where like Sonic was taken seriously, unfortunately. They're good games though. Recommend them. They're fun and easy to get into. And then it's just a great system all around. Like, there's plenty of great games on it. Plenty to do with Dreamcast. So, in conclusion, I would recommend to the retro gamer starting out to have a Genesis, a PlayStation 2, and a Sega Dreamcast. You could swap out the PlayStation 2 for an Xbox, but if you're just starting out, the PlayStation 2 is a much better option because just of how many more games there are. I mean, technically the games run better on an Xbox because it's more powerful, but the PlayStation 2 versions look pretty great as well for the time, so a PlayStation 2, which can be swapped with any other 6th generation console, they're all great, plus a Dreamcast and a Sega Genesis. That's the 4 systems I would recommend anyone start with a retro gaming collection because they're relatively affordable, great games across the board on all of them, and easy to collect for because especially on the Genesis and PlayStation 2, there are so many games. If you want to get a PS1 as well, I mean you can, but if you're just starting out, I'd recommend just getting a PS2 and playing it that way. But that's going to be the end of this video. Thank you for watching, everyone. Sorry it's a little later. Leave a comment saying what you'd want to see next if you have any suggestions. And I will see you next time, hopefully on time. Goodbye.